Hello and welcome, dear listener. Before we begin our relaxing journey back in time, I want to extend a warm greeting and thank you for joining me tonight. Whether you're just settling into bed, already drifting off to sleep, or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm glad you've chosen to spend this time here with me. As we embark on this exploration of history together, I'd love to know a little bit about you. If you're so inclined, please leave a comment sharing where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day or night it is for you right now. Are the stars out where you are? Is the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon? Knowing that we're connected across time and space as we delve into the past makes this feel like an even more meaningful shared experience. If you find yourself enjoying this style of soft, leisurely storytelling that weaves together history and narrative, I invite you to subscribe so that you can easily drift off to more calming tales in the future. There's something uniquely soothing about quietly absorbing fascinating details about times gone by as you unwind and let your mind wander. Think of it as a bedtime story for your forever curious spirit. Tonight, we'll be turning the pages of time back to feudal Japan, an era spanning from the 12th to the 19th century. We'll immerse ourselves in the daily lives of the peasantry and explore what made their existence so challenging. But before we descend into the gritty realities, let's first set the stage with a more idyllic scene. Picture, if you will, a small village nestled in a lush valley surrounded by mist-shrouded mountains and whispering bamboo forests. Thatched roofs dot the landscape, sheltering humble homes with earthen walls and woven tatami mats. The air is filled with the soft clamour of rural life, the distant ringing of a temple bell, the gentle murmur of a stream, the occasional lowing of an ox. Tender green shoots of rice sway in the paddies that terrace the foothills, lovingly tended by weathered hands. Woven hats bob amidst the fields as men, women and children alike toil under the warm sun, their backs bent in an ancient dance of planting, weeding and harvesting. There is a timeless rhythm to their days, dictated by the turning of the seasons and the capricious hand of Mother Nature. At first glance, it might seem a simple, even peaceful existence, but hardship lingers in the worn creases of smiles, in the calluses on palms, in the quiet sighs at day's end. The tranquil surface belies an undercurrent of difficulty and injustice, the weight of which we will soon uncover. Though our story is set hundreds of years ago and thousands of miles away, the struggles and triumphs of the human spirit remain a common thread that binds us across the ages. In learning of their lives, perhaps we will discover a newfound gratitude for our own, and as we drift off to sleep, their memories might mingle with our dreams, a reminder of our shared humanity echoing in the chambers of history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let us first meet a young rice farmer named Jiro and his family, through whose eyes we will witness the unfolding of an era. In feudal Japan, society was rigidly structured into a hierarchy of social classes. At the top sat the emperor and the court nobility, followed by the powerful warrior class known as the samurai. Below them were the artisans and merchants, and at the very bottom, supporting the entire social edifice, were the peasants. Jiro was born into this lowly class, inheriting a life of servitude and backbreaking labour from his father and his father before him. In the grand scheme of things, his existence was considered insignificant, his destiny predetermined by an accident of birth. Social mobility was practically non-existent in feudal times. A peasant could never dream of becoming a samurai, no matter how skilled with a blade or how noble of heart. Likewise, a samurai would never stoop to toil in the rice paddies or wed a commoner. Each person had their fixed place in the hierarchy, and to step outside those bounds was to court punishment or disgrace. This rigid structure was exemplified and reinforced by influential figures like Tokugawa Ieyasu, the powerful shogun who ushered in an era of strict social order and stability in the early 17th century. Under his rule, the classes were systematically segregated and their roles clearly defined. Peasants were expected to obediently serve their lords, pay their taxes, and never question their lot in life. For young Jiro and his fellow rice farmers, this meant a lifetime of dawn-to-dusk labor in the fields, with little hope of ever changing their station. They were the foundation upon which feudal society rested, and yet they reaped few rewards for their vital role. As Jiro stepped out into the misty morning light and gazed upon the verdant paddies stretching before him, he felt the weight of this centuries-old system bearing down on his shoulders. He knew that his path had been preordained, that his destiny was to bend his back and muddy his hands so that others might prosper. And yet, in the face of this grim reality, there was a quiet strength that pulsed through Jiro and his village. A resilience born of generations who had endured hardship with dignity, finding small joys and meaning in the midst of suffering. It was this unbreakable spirit that would sustain them through the trials to come. As we leave Jiro to begin his day's work, let us take a moment to reflect on the rigid social structures that have shaped so many lives throughout history. Though the specifics may vary across cultures and eras, the experience of feeling trapped by one's birth and circumstances is a sadly familiar one. It's a reminder to appreciate the freedoms and opportunities we often take for granted in our modern world. Next, we'll explore more deeply the back-breaking labour that filled the peasants' days and the toll it took on body and spirit alike. But for now, as you sink deeper into your pillow and let your eyelids grow heavy, picture Jiro walking amongst the swaying stalks of green, his face turned up to the golden sun, finding a glimmer of peace in the midst of an unforgiving world. Rest well, dear listener, and let your dreams carry you back to a distant time and a far-off place, where hardship and beauty intertwined like shoots of rice in an ancient paddy. There is much more to come, but for now, simply let the gentle murmur of history lull you into a restful slumber. As we've seen, the peasants of feudal Japan faced centuries of exploitation, back-breaking labor, and social immobility under the rigid class hierarchy. But even in the midst of such hardship, they managed to find small joys and meaning through their relationships with each other. Picture a humble peasant village at dusk, after a long day toiling in the rice fields. The smell of cooking fires wafts through the air as families gather in their small thatched huts to share a meager but hard-earned meal. Children chase each other and play in the dirt streets, their laughter echoing off the worn walls. As darkness falls, the villagers come together in the flickering firelight. The elderly spin tales of bygone days and local legends, passing on wisdom and tradition to the next generation. Young couples steal glances at each other, dreaming of building a life and family together against the odds. On special occasions, the village erupts in colour and song for festivals honouring the gods and changing of the seasons. Women clad in simple cotton kimono dance with graceful steps, while the men beat drums and pluck strings in jaunty rhythms. For a brief time, the hardships of daily life fade away, and the community bonds over shared faith and celebration. Even in the face of famine, natural disasters, and punishing taxes, these moments of simple joy and connection gave the peasants something to live for. The family and community ties forged through shared suffering and small pleasures formed a crucial social fabric. Though the feudal system kept them trapped in poverty for centuries, the villagers drew resilience from one another. Huddled together around the hearth on a cold winter's night, a father mends a fishing net while the mother patches old clothes. Grandparents bounce babies on their knees and sing soft lullabies. In these mundane daily rituals, the peasants found a sense of purpose, identity, and belonging. Of course, village life was not always so idyllic. Neighbours squabbled over land boundaries, irrigation rights, and petty slights. Jealousies and resentments simmered beneath the surface. The very closeness of village society could be suffocating at times. But in a world defined by scarcity and social stratification, the peasants clung fiercely to what little they had: their families, their ancestral plots, their local traditions. The changing seasons marked the rhythms of their lives: the planting and harvesting of rice, the rituals for birth, marriage and death. Though they bent their backs under the hot sun and pounded rain day after day, the peasants drew quiet dignity and meaning from working the land. With each seed sown and grain harvested, they played a part in the great cycle of life, honouring the ancestors who came before them and providing for the children who would come after. As a young peasant boy learns to wield a scythe from his weathered grandfather, he absorbs more than just practical skills. He inherits a way of life, a set of values, a sense of his place in the world. The pride in his grandfather's eyes as he masters the tool speaks to something deeper: the passing down of an identity rooted in the soil. So as we drift off to sleep, let us hold in our hearts the struggles and the triumphs of these forgotten peasants. Across the centuries, their quiet courage and resilience in the face of adversity speak to the enduring human spirit. Though their names may be lost to history, their stories live on in the land they tilled and the timeless rhythms of village life that echo to this day. In our modern world of convenience and mobility, it's easy to forget the hardships faced by those who came before us. The peasants of feudal Japan may have lived hundreds of years ago in a society vastly different from our own. But in their struggles to find meaning and joy in a life of unrelenting hardship, we see a reflection of our common humanity. So let us honour their memory and draw inspiration from their quiet strength. As we sink into the comfort of our beds, let us dream of a world where all people, regardless of birth or status, may live with dignity, purpose, and moments of simple happiness. A world that the peasants of feudal Japan could only imagine, but one that we have the power to create together. And as we slip into the realm of unconsciousness, let the gentle rhythms of daily life in a long-ago village lull us into a deep and peaceful slumber. The soft patter of rain on thatched roofs, the distant lowing of oxen in the fields, the low murmur of mothers singing their children to sleep. Let these timeless sounds be a comforting lullaby from across the ages. In our dreams, perhaps we will walk alongside the peasants in their muddy rice paddies and sit with them around the crackling hearth. We will break bread with them, share their sorrows and their hopes, and understand a little more of what it means to be human. For in the end, we are all peasants in the grand scheme of history. Strug. As we ponder the plight of the peasants, it's important to remember that the samurai themselves were not a monolithic group. Among their ranks were both cruel oppressors and more principled warriors who tried to live up to the ideals of bushido, the way of the warrior. One such figure was Yamamoto Tsunetomo, a samurai who lived in the early 18th century. Born into the Saga domain on the island of Kyushu, Yamamoto served as a retainer to the daimyo Nabeshima Mitsushige. However, when his lord died in 1700, Yamamoto was denied the right to follow him into death through the ritual suicide known as junshi. This was because the Tokugawa shogunate had recently banned the practice, trying to curb the loss of able-bodied samurai. Denied this final honor, Yamamoto shaved his head and retired to a hermitage, taking on the name Yamamoto Jocho. There, he devoted himself to pondering bushido and what it truly meant to live and die as a warrior. Over the next 7 years, Yamamoto dictated his thoughts to a young scribe named Tashiro Tsurumoto. These collected aphorisms and anecdotes would become a book called the Hagakure, which translates to Hidden by the Leaves. Though the Hagakure covered many aspects of a warrior's life, from battlefield tactics to clan politics, some of its most striking passages deal with the treatment of commoners. Yamamoto believed that a true samurai should show benevolence and mercy to the peasants under his protection. In one anecdote, he praises a young lord who forgave the taxes of a village afflicted by famine, saving countless lives. It is a matter of regret to think that one lives in a world where a man dies of hunger before your eyes, Yamamoto wrote. If one has even a little bit of a samurai's power, he should use it to save people's lives. These words stand in stark contrast to the cruel indifference shown by many warriors of the age. For most samurai, the peasantry was little more than a resource to be exploited, their lives and labors disposable. Tales abound of callous samurai cutting down farmers for minor slights or perceived insolence. The right of kirisute gomen, which allowed a warrior to strike down a commoner with impunity, was a terrifying emblem of this unequal power dynamic. But Yamamoto argued that such wanton cruelty was beneath a true follower of bushido. He believed that samurai should embody the virtues of wisdom, courage, and benevolence, protecting the weak rather than preying upon them. Only then could a warrior earn the respect and devotion of the common folk. A samurai should always keep in mind the precept to be devoted to the people, he wrote, and so he should try to make the people entrust themselves to him. If he has their trust once, then they will follow him anywhere. The samurai can depend on such people. Yamamoto's words, recorded in the Hagakure, would go on to shape perceptions of the samurai ideal for generations to come. In the tumultuous years after the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate, nationalists would seize upon his concept of bushido to promote loyalty and self-sacrifice in service of the emperor and the state. But the core of Yamamoto's philosophy was a call for compassion and justice, even in a brutally hierarchical age. He understood that true strength came not from oppressing the weak, but from protecting them. It was a message that many of his fellow samurai failed to heed, to the great detriment of the peasantry they ruled over. As we lie here in the dark, our minds drifting back across the centuries, it's comforting to know that even in the bleakest times, there were glimmers of humanity and conscience. Warriors like Yamamoto Tsunetomo, who saw the value in every life, no matter how humble. Their example may have been the exception rather than the rule, but it reminds us that the human spirit can find light, even in the darkest of ages. And so, as our thoughts turn once more to the hardships endured by the peasantry, we can take solace in the fact that their suffering was not entirely unwitnessed, that here and there, in the words of philosophers and the deeds of kinder lords, there was an acknowledgement of their plight, however small. It could not change the crushing realities of their feudal world, but perhaps it offered a tiny spark of hope. The hope that even the lowest among them deserve better than hunger and servitude. The hope that one day, the hidden value of their humanity would be more than just a flicker amid the shadows. With that faint but stubborn light in mind, let us continue our journey through the dark annals of history. The road ahead is long and strewn with sorrow, but walk it we must, guided by empathy and the quest for understanding. So let your breathing slow and your body settle deeper into repose. We have many miles yet to cover on this twisting path through Japan's feudal past. Many more tales to uncover beneath the fallen leaves of time. As the sun sets over the wooded hills, the last rays of golden light bathe the village in a gentle glow. Smoke rises from the thatched roofs of the peasant huts as families gather around hearths to share a meager evening meal. The day's toil in the rice paddies is done, but the aches and pains linger in their weary bodies. This is the daily rhythm of life for the peasants of feudal Japan, an existence of unrelenting labor, poverty, and subservience to their samurai overlords. In this rigidly structured society, the destiny of a peasant was fixed from birth. To be born into the farming class was to be consigned to a life of servitude with virtually no hope of upward mobility. While the samurai elite enjoyed a life of privilege and prestige, the peasants were little more than serfs, tied to the land and the whims of their masters. This oppressive social order was codified and reinforced by powerful figures like Tokugawa Ieyasu, the great shogun who united Japan under his rule in the early 1600s. Though Ieyasu brought an end to centuries of civil war, he also ushered in an era of even stricter social stratification. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, the samurai class was elevated to new heights of power and privilege, while the peasantry was further subjugated and exploited. For the average peasant family, life revolved around the relentless cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting rice. From dawn until dusk, men, women, and children toiled in the paddies, bent double as they planted seedlings or harvested the ripe grain by hand. It was back-breaking labor, performed with primitive tools and brute strength. There were no days off, no respite from the arduous work that kept the ruling classes fed and the country running. The seasons of the rice crop dictated the rhythm of village life. In the spring, the paddies were flooded and the seedlings carefully transplanted by hand. As the summer sun beat down, the paddies had to be constantly weeded and the water levels meticulously managed. Finally, in the autumn, the ripe grain was painstakingly cut, stalk by stalk with sickles, and laid out to dry. Every member of the family had a role to play in this unending agricultural labor. The men ploughed the fields with oxen and carried heavy loads. The women planted, weeded, and harvested alongside them. Even the children were put to work as soon as they could walk, scaring away birds or helping to thresh the harvested rice. There was no time for play or education. Survival depended on everyone's contribution. But even after all this back-breaking labor, the peasant families reaped few rewards. A significant portion of their hard-earned harvest was taken away as tax and tribute to their feudal lords and the shogunate. These heavy levies were collected by the samurai class, who would descend on the villages each year to assess the harvest and claim their share. For the peasants, this system of taxation was crippling. In good years, the village might barely scrape by after rendering up the required amount of rice. But in years of poor harvest or natural disaster, the results could be catastrophic. Unable to pay their taxes, peasant families could be cast off their land or reduced to starvation. One poignant example of this cruel system was the story of Sakura Sogoro, a peasant leader from a village in what is now Chiba Prefecture. In the year 1653, after a series of poor harvests and heavy taxation, Sogoro and his fellow villagers were left on the brink of starvation. In desperation, Sogoro traveled to the capital of Edo to petition the shogun directly for tax relief. It was an extraordinary act of courage and defiance for a mere peasant to challenge the authority of his samurai overlords. Sogoro managed to present his petition at the gates of the shogun's castle, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. Not only was the petition rejected, but Sogoro was arrested and executed for his impudence. His fellow villagers, who had accompanied him on the journey, were also punished and exiled. The tragic story of Sakura Sogoro exemplified the hopelessness and injustice of life for Japan's feudal peasants. They were utterly at the mercy of the samurai class, who had almost unlimited power over them. The concept of kirisute gomen, which allowed a samurai to strike down a commoner for any perceived slight or disrespect, was a chilling reminder of this imbalance of power. Faced with such oppression and exploitation, it was little wonder that peasant villages often teetered on the brink of survival. One bad harvest or natural disaster could spell ruin. Famines became increasingly common in the later years of the Tokugawa period, as population growth outstripped agricultural production. In the year 1732, a devastating famine known as the Kyoho famine ravaged the country after a series of prolonged droughts and crop failures. Desperate peasants were reduced to eating grass, tree bark, and even clay to survive. Countless villagers starved to death or were forced to abandon their lands in search of food. It was against this backdrop of grinding poverty, hunger, and mistreatment that peasant uprisings began to erupt across Japan. Though armed revolt against the samurai was almost always doomed to bloody failure, the crushing weight of their suffering sometimes drove villagers to desperate acts of defiance. One of the most famous of these rebellions was the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 to 38. On the remote Shimabara Peninsula in Kyushu, a group of impoverished peasants and persecuted Christians rose up against their feudal rulers. Led by a charismatic teenage boy named Amakusa Shiro, the rebels seized a local castle and fortified it against attack. For several months, the peasant army held out against a massive samurai force sent to suppress them. But eventually, the castle fell and the rebellion was brutally crushed. The teenage leader Shiro was beheaded and thousands of rebels were massacred. In the aftermath, Christianity was further suppressed and the already wretched lives of the peasantry became even more tightly controlled. Stories like the Shimabara Rebellion highlight the desperate cycle of poverty, exploitation, and futile resistance that characterize the lives of feudal Japanese peasants. But even in the face of such unrelenting hardship, the human spirit found ways to endure and even find small joys. The bonds of family and community were a vital source of strength for the peasantry. Despite their poverty, village life was marked by a rich tapestry of cultural traditions and shared rituals. Weddings and funerals brought the community together in shared celebration or mourning. Festivals and religious ceremonies provided a brief respite from the daily grind and a chance to connect with the sacred. In the quiet moments between the constant toil, simple pleasures could still be found. Women sang folk songs as they worked the looms, weaving cloth for the village. Old men told stories and passed down ancestral wisdom to the children gathered at their feet. Young couples stole kisses behind the rice stacks and dreamed of a better life for their families. But despite these glimmers of humanity, the bitter reality was that life for Japan's peasantry remained mired in poverty and oppression for centuries on end. While the samurai class enjoyed an efflorescence of art, culture, and political power, the farmers who toiled in the fields saw little change or progress in their condition. This feudal system, with its rigid hierarchy and institutionalized inequality, endured for over 250 years until the Meiji Restoration of 1868 finally brought an end to the Tokugawa shogunate. But even as Japan began to modernize and industrialize, the legacy of this deeply unequal society would endure. For the generations of peasants who lived and died under the yoke of feudalism, life was an unending cycle of hardship, hunger, and subordination to their masters. Most would never know a life beyond the confines of their village and the daily struggle for subsistence. As we drift off to sleep in our comfortable modern world, it is hard to fathom the immense challenges and injustices they faced. But in remembering their stories, we honor their resilience and fortitude in the face of adversity. Their hard labor and sacrifices laid the foundation for the Japan we know today. Though centuries have passed, the echoes of their struggles still whisper in the wind that rustles through the rice paddies. In the deep quiet of the night, we can almost hear the distant songs of the women at their looms and the laughter of the children playing between the huts. As sleep draws us into its gentle embrace, let us hold a space in our dreams for the forgotten peasants of feudal Japan, those who toiled, suffered, and endured so much, and yet managed to keep the flame of human spirit alive through the long centuries of darkness. May their stories remind us to be grateful for the freedoms and comforts we enjoy today, and to honor the courage and resilience of the human heart in the face of even the greatest of hardships. And so, as the last embers fade in the hearth and the moon casts its silvery light over the sleeping village, we bid goodnight to the generations of peasants who came before us. May their spirits find the peace and rest that so often eluded them in life. And may their stories continue to teach and inspire us from beyond the veil of time. Good night and sweet dreams. As the sun dipped below the wooded hills, an uneasy silence settled over the tiny peasant village. Smoke from cooking fires hung low in the evening air, mingling with the sweet smell of ripening rice in the paddies. Weary farmers trudged home to their thatched roof huts after another long day bent over in the fields. Rags hung from their weathered bodies. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. This had been the way of life for generations, an endless cycle of planting and harvesting, of toil and deprivation, of servitude to the elevated classes. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the great unifier of Japan, had solidified this rigid social hierarchy in the early 1600s. It would endure for over 250 years, until the dawn of the modern era. At the top of this feudal pyramid sat the mighty samurai, an elite warrior class that comprised only 8% of the population, yet wielded absolute power. Beneath them were the artisans and merchants, valued for their skills and products. But at the very bottom, comprising over 80% of the people, were the lowly peasants, the rice farmers, the serfs, the expendable masses. A peasant's lot was one of lifelong subjugation. Born into poverty, they were shackled to the land, forbidden to leave their village or change their occupation. Social mobility was but a distant dream. Hard labour was their birthright and their obligation to their feudal masters. Each day brought a weary repetition of sowing, weeding, irrigating, and harvesting the rice crop that sustained the nation. The work was backbreaking, a test of endurance from dawn to dusk. Men, women, and even children toiled together knee-deep in the muddy rice paddies beneath the scorching sun and the heavy monsoon rains. Primitive hand tools were their only aid. Wooden ploughs pulled by oxen, sickles to cut the grain heads, flails to thresh the rice on the drying racks. Season by season, the unrelenting labour wore down their bodies. Calloused hands, aching joints, stubborn wounds. But there could be no rest, for the rice was both their sustenance and their tax. The village's very survival depended on bringing in a good harvest. And woe to those who failed to meet their quotas. The annual land tax, nengu, was an inescapable burden. Usually set at around 40% of the harvest, it was collected by the local feudal lord, the daimyo. In times of poor yield, this tax could leave a village with barely enough rice to feed itself. And the nengu was but one of many levies imposed upon the farmers. There was the forced labour tax, buyaku, which required peasants to work on the lord's own land or on infrastructure projects for up to 50 days per year. The religious dues, teramai, paid to the local Buddhist temples. Samurai might even demand impromptu tributes when passing through a village: rice, chickens, silk, sake. To refuse was unthinkable. This crushing taxation left peasants trapped in an endless cycle of poverty. There was little chance of ever getting ahead or building up food reserves. When the weather was favourable and the harvest plentiful, they could just barely get by, but one poor crop could spell disaster. And so it was for the village of Akanuma in the summer of 1732. After an unusually cold, wet spring, the rice stalks grew stunted and yellow, their grains shriveled and discoloured with mould. As the meagre harvest came in, the headman, Goro, grew increasingly anxious. There was not enough rice, not nearly enough, to feed the village and still pay the nengu. Goro was a proud man who had served the village for over a decade. He knew every family, shared in their joys and hardships. The thought of them going hungry tore at his aging heart. Surely the daimyo's magistrate would understand their plight. Surely he would agree to reduce the taxes. just until the village could recover. It was their only hope. With great trepidation, Goro set out for the castle town to humbly petition the magistrate. He prostrated himself before the great man and with shaking hands presented his request. But the magistrate was unmoved. Taxes were taxes. Any shortfall would have to be made up next season, with interest. To even ask was an act of impertinence. Goro returned to the village with a heavy heart and gathered the farmers to deliver the grim news. They would have to dig deep into their reserves to borrow rice against future harvests just to scrape by. Women wept and children whimpered with hunger, and an impotent rage smoldered in the eyes of the men. But what choice was there? A peasant could not appeal a magistrate's decision. They could not protest or negotiate. They were but cogs in the machine of the rice economy, powerless and insignificant. The calloused hands that fed the nation were the weakest in the realm. Perhaps some solace could be found in the village shrine, enchanting the Lotus Sutra by smoky candlelight, or in the squeals of children playing in the rice fields, not yet broken by hardship. Mothers hushed their hungry babies, praying they would never know chronic emptiness. Young couples clung to each other in the night, thankful for the warmth. These were the small graces that made life bearable, the slivers of humanity that even the cruelest tyranny could not stamp out. But they could not fill empty bellies or lighten the feudal yoke. Akanuma would limp on, wounded but unbroken, trapped in a centuries-long stagnation imposed by the samurai lords. For this was the peasant's lot, the price of being born at the bottom of the pyramid. Too poor to escape, too powerless to challenge the system, they were the unseen engine that fueled a feudal machine stacked against them in every way. Without their dawn-to-dusk toil, their sweat and blood and sacrifices, the nation would crumble. Yet their suffering was invisible, their struggles unrecorded in the annals of the elite. Epic tales would be written of samurai valor and imperial intrigues, while the farmers quietly endured the unendurable. Bowed but not broken, they would plant again next spring with an almost spiritual determination. They would coax life from the earth to ensure the village survived. This was the essence of the peasant spirit, the strength to carry on in a world of unrelenting adversity. As darkness enveloped the village of Akanuma, as exhausted bodies surrendered to slumber, a whisper lingered on the night breeze. It rippled through the emerald rice paddies and danced across the thatched roofs. A whisper of resilience, of human endurance in the face of impossible odds. Perhaps one day this crushing cycle would end. Perhaps one day the rice farmers' sweat would water their own prosperity. But until that distant dawn, they would abide. With an innate, unshakable dignity, they would endure. Across the generations and across the centuries, the beating heart of feudal Japan would carry on. Part 5. Famines and natural disasters. As if backbreaking labor and heavy taxation weren't enough, Japanese peasants also lived under the constant threat of famines and natural disasters. With little food stored up and few reserves, agrarian villages were precariously vulnerable to the whims of weather and the ravages of nature. Imagine the scene. A small, thatched hut hamlet nestled in the mountains, its rice paddies stretching out in neat green terraces. The villagers toil from sunrise to sunset, tending their precious crops with care and devotion. Their very lives depend on the success of the harvest. But one summer, the rains fail to come. The skies remain ominously clear day after day, and the paddies begin to dry out. The rice stalks wither and droop, turning brittle and yellow under the merciless sun. Prayers are offered, rituals performed, but to no avail. With heavy hearts, the peasants watch their crops shrivel and their hopes for the future evaporate. As the drought drags on and meagre supplies run low, an uneasy desperation takes hold. The children cry out with hunger, their normally vibrant eyes dull and listless. Parents give up their own meals to nourish their young. The elderly and infirm began to succumb. Once joyful village life turns grim and subdued as starvation stalks ever closer. Finally, the famine takes its terrible toll. Whole families waste away, perishing together in their huts. The survivors are left shattered and reeling, facing the grim prospect of rebuilding their lives from ashes. This scene played out all too often across feudal Japan, as merciless cycles of drought and blight decimated crops and shattered agrarian communities. But it wasn't just the lack of rain that peasants had to fear. Japan's rugged islands are also prone to typhoons, floods, earthquakes, and tsunamis. When disaster struck, it showed little mercy for the meager dwellings of the poor. Picture a different village, this one tucked along a misty river near the coast. Here, life revolves around fishing as much as farming, with peasant men hauling nets while women mend and weave. All is well until one fateful autumn day when black storm clouds gather on the horizon. As the typhoon roars ashore, ripping tiles from roofs and sending peasants scrambling for shelter, the river swells and rises. Lashed by blinding sheets of rain, it leaps its banks and surges into the village, a churning wall of brown water. Amidst the chaos of whipping winds and pelting rain, panicked families try desperately to save their loved ones and salvage precious belongings. Mothers clutch wailing children, the elderly are dragged to higher ground, but many are simply swept away by the raging current, plunged into watery oblivion. When the skies finally clear, the survivors emerge from the wreckage of their homes to an unrecognizable landscape. Rice paddies, painstakingly carved and tended, are now swamped and ruined. Fishing boats lie smashed and splintered on the shore. Ancestral huts have been reduced to sodden rubble. With so much lost and winter fast approaching, once industrious villagers now face gnawing hunger and exposure. They have little choice but to try to rebuild, knowing they are utterly powerless against the forces of storm and sea. Such was the precarious plight of peasants in the face of nature's fury. Sadly, these localized disasters were compounded by larger climate trends that spelled tragedy for the lower classes. As Japan's population grew in later feudal times, and more marginal lands were cultivated to feed the masses, the spectre of famine began to loom ever larger. With little resilience to absorb crop failures and few food reserves, peasants were perpetually perched on a precipice, deeply vulnerable to shifts in weather patterns. When the temperatures dropped and harvests failed across wide regions in the 1780s, it set the stage for the devastating Tenmei famine, a catastrophe that would claim over 1 million lives. And so, to be a peasant in feudal Japan was to live forever at the mercy of an unforgiving sky and a fickle earth. It meant laboring to eke out sustenance from the very elements that could turn, at any moment, to unleash ruin. It's a bitter irony that those who toiled hardest to reap the abundance of the land were also the most vulnerable to its wrath. As we drift to sleep in an age of ample food and sturdy shelter, we might spare a thought for those who struggled and starved at the whim of a cloud or a tremor, forever bracing for the next disaster in a feudal world with little safety net. Part 6. Peasant Uprisings and Unrest. Given the relentless hardships they faced, from onerous taxes to cruel exploitation, it's little wonder that Japan's feudal peasants sometimes sank into despair and desperation. But even the downtrodden can only endure so much before they reach a breaking point. At times, when injustice and suffering grew too great to bear, some brave peasants dared to defy their masters and rise up in open revolt. One need only consider the tragic tale of Sakura Sogoro to appreciate the depths of peasant misery and the terrible risks of rebellion. Sogoro was the headman of a small village in what is now Chiba Prefecture, a region battered by heavy rains and flooding in the mid-1600s. When the local daimyo harshly continued to levy rice taxes despite the ruined harvests, the villagers were left destitute and starving. Moved by their plight and unable to bear watching his people perish, Sogoro made the brave but fateful decision to appeal directly to the shogun for help. In 1652, he travelled all the way to the capital of Edo and tried to present the villagers' dire straits in a petition. But for a lowly peasant to approach the shogun was a terrible breach of protocol, a crime that carried the death penalty. Sogoro knew the grave risk he was taking, but he proceeded nonetheless out of love and duty to his village. In the end, his courageous plea was cruelly rejected. Not only was he executed for his impudence, but his wife, children, and even grandchildren were also put to death as a warning against peasant disobedience. His whole family was wiped out, dying for the crime of daring to question their lot. Yet even this horror failed to fully quell the embers of peasant defiance. The decades to come would see more and more villagers driven to desperation by mistreatment and starvation. Some fled the land and became outlaws. Others banded together to attack and rob the estates of the wealthy. But the most dramatic expression of peasant anguish came in the form of outright armed uprisings. Though such revolts were put down ruthlessly, they still erupted with a shocking regularity across the later feudal period as conditions deteriorated. The 1637th Shimabara Rebellion is a prime example of this explosive unrest. On the Shimabara Peninsula, a toxic mix of religious persecution of Christians, harsh taxation, and cruel treatment by samurai lords finally drove long-suffering peasants to rebel. Along with masterless Ronin samurai, they took up swords, spears, and even farming tools and rose up against their overlords in open defiance. For months, these desperate rebels fought bravely against the armies of the shogun, even seizing and fortifying a castle. But in the end, the woefully outmatched peasants and their allies were surrounded, besieged, and ruthlessly annihilated. After a long and bloody struggle, the Shimabara castle fell, and some 37,000 rebels, men and women both, were massacred. The horror of Shimabara sent shockwaves across Japan and set off harsh crackdowns and restrictions for peasants everywhere as the samurai class rushed to contain the unrest. Villagers were disarmed, their travel curtailed, and surveillance increased. The small gains in status some communities had won were rolled back as the feudal order reasserted control with an iron fist. For many peasants, the cruel fates of Sogoro and Shimabara drove home the futility of challenging their feudal bonds. Faced with the military might and utter ruthlessness of the samurai, armed resistance seemed to lead only to tragedy and suffering, even worse than what they already endured. As the centuries ground on, most resigned themselves to their lot, however wretched. But even still, the injustice burned and resentment smouldered in the hearts of the downtrodden. As Japan entered an era of growing economic strain in the 18th and 19th centuries, with famines and crises multiplying, more and more villagers would be driven to the edge. And so, time and again, the cycle of unrest would repeat. Protests and petitions, outbreaks of violence and robbery, desperate uprisings and bloody suppressions. It was a grim dance that would carry on right until the very twilight of the feudal era, an endless loop of anguish unresolved. Though each revolt was crushed in turn, they still echo through history as a haunting reminder of the immense hardship and cruelty feudal peasants endured for centuries. One can only imagine the pain and despair that would drive humble villagers to rise up against impossible odds, laying down their lives for the slimmest chance at justice. As we sink into the comfort of our beds tonight, in a world where political protest is a protected right, spare a thought for those brave souls of centuries past, the peasant rebels of feudal Japan. Dreamers and fighters, they gave their lives to defy a system of a virtual slavery, to rage against the dying of the light. May they remind us that even the most downtrodden may still choose defiance over despair, and that the human spirit can be an unquenchable force, when pushed beyond the limits of endurance. Despite the oppressive weight of the feudal system bearing down upon them, Japan's peasants were not without their small joys and cherished village traditions. Even in the face of grinding poverty and ceaseless toil, life had to be more than mere survival. After all, what is the human spirit if not the flickering flame of hope and fellowship dancing defiantly against the encroaching darkness? Picture, if you will, a hamlet nestled in the verdant hills, the sun's dying rays painting the rice paddies in shades of molten gold. The day's back-breaking labour may be done, but the village is coming alive in a whole new way. Rough-spun clothes are traded for more colourful and festive attire. Cheerful lanterns bob and weave like playful spirits, guiding villagers to the central square. The mouth-watering aroma of skewered meats and vegetables grilling over crackling flames mingles with the pulse-quickening rhythms of drums and flutes. This is the night of the village Matsuri, the festival, a time to cast off the weight of daily burdens and embrace the simple joys of community, tradition, and shared revelry. Young and old alike are swept up in the tide of celebration. Children dart and weave between the legs of their elders, their laughter a tinkling counterpoint to the music. Adolescents eye each other with all the awkwardness and anticipation of youth, shyly flirting in the shadows of the bonfire. Their parents look on indulgently, remembering their own festival courtships, even as they slip into the familiar, comfortable patterns of long friendship with their peers. Bonds of family and community are affirmed and strengthened on nights like this. Hardships faced together foster a sense of kinship and solidarity that sees the villagers through their darkest days. A marriage is arranged between the eldest son of the village headman and the miller's daughter, sealing the promise of the next generation. Two men who recently bickered over a property line now stand with arms slung around each other's shoulders, their quarrel forgotten in the warming glow of good sake. An aging grandmother, wreathed in smiles, cuddles a newborn grandchild to her bosom and croons a lullaby, the same one her own grandmother once sang to her. These moments of brightness and bonding arms the villagers with renewed strength, purpose, and identity before they must take up the yoke of feudal obligations once more. The festivals provide a vital pressure valve, a way for the collective tension and despair to be released before it builds to the breaking point. A reminder that they are more than mere beasts of burden. They are a people with a proud shared heritage and cultural soul all their own. Even in the rhythms of daily life, Japan's peasants fight to carve out snatches of beauty and meaning amid the mind-numbing drudgery. The village women gather to weave, spin and sew together, the hypnotic clacking of their looms giving meter to the songs, and chatter rising and falling like the brightly coloured threads taking shape in their hands. Through these female arts, a sublime aesthetic and tradition is passed from nimble fingers to attentive eyes, mother to daughter, down through the generations. Hunched in his dim workshop, a wizened old woodworker pours a lifetime of skill into carving an exquisite inlaid tansu chest for his daughter's wedding trousseau, his permanently calloused hands coaxing out delicate plum blossoms and elegant cranes from the stubborn wood. He smiles wistfully, knowing that this labour of love will long outlast him, a tangible legacy, and dowry his poverty would otherwise never have allowed him to give. Gathered around a merrily crackling hearth on a bitter winter's eve, the village elders regale the bright-eyed youngsters with folk tales and legends passed down through countless generations. Mythic heroes, star-crossed lovers, mischievous animals and vengeful ghosts populate these tall tales, each one imparting some small lesson or nugget of folk wisdom to the eagerly listening children. More than mere entertainment, these stories are the threads that bind the villagers to their past and to each other, weaving a rich cultural tapestry that lends shape and meaning to their hardscrabble existence. Yes, Japan's feudal peasants seized every chance, no matter how small, to infuse their toil-worn lives with art, song, story, love, and laughter. These patchwork scraps of joy and beauty were hard-won, all the more precious for their scarcity, and peasants clung to them with all the fierce tenacity that extreme privation engraves on the soul. And yet, as sustaining as these moments of light were, they remained but brief respites against the crushing, centuries-long stagnation that was endemic to feudal Japan. The same traditions that gave peasant life structure and meaning also calcified into a rigid cage from which there was no escape. Generations were born, struggled and died under the same yoke of servitude their ancestors had endured, with precious little progress to mark the turning of the years. While art and culture flourished among the elite samurai and nobles over the long feudal era, the peasants remained mired in a changeless purgatory of endless drudgery and exploitation. Creativity, ingenuity, and ambition, when they dared to surface at all, were ruthlessly channeled into the narrow furrows of rice cultivation, social stability, and upholding of the status quo. Those with the misfortune to be born into the peasant class lived and died well-trained cogs in a machine designed to maintain the power and privilege of their overlords. There would be no renaissance for the Japanese peasants, no rising tides of socio-economic progress, or opportunity to lift their boats to a brighter shore. Their horizons remained forever stunted, their spirits caged, their potential mortgaged to serve the bloated excess of the ruling elite. The flames of their innate human brilliance and vitality were banked to a mere flicker, constrained to casting what little warmth and illumination they could into the hovels and huts of their unchanging ancestral villages. Only with the dawn of the Meiji Restoration in the mid-19th century did the first cracks finally begin to appear in the edifice of feudal oppression that had confined Japan's peasants for so long. But even then, deeply entrenched social hierarchies and attitudes were slow to crumble. The shackles of an inherited underclass not easily thrown off after so many generations of conditioning. A new Japan was emerging into the modern world, but the long-suffering souls who had toiled for centuries under the boot of feudalism would be among the last to see the light. And so we return to the peasant village as the moon rises and the festival fires burn low to embers. The lanterns wink out one by one, and the weary revelers return to their humble homes to rest for a few scant hours before a new day of toil dawns. Yet they carry the glow of the celebration in their hearts, a talisman against the hardships to come. In whispered prayers and in fitful dreams, their ancestors call to them down the long, winding path of history, urging them to endure, to persist, to carry the flame of their people forward however they can. There is a certain poetry in this image of the slumbering peasant, snatching a few moments of hard-won peace between the daily battles of survival. We may be separated from their world by vast gulfs of time and progress, but there is still something deeply recognizable, even relatable, in their fundamental humanity, their stubborn resilience in the face of adversity, the way they fought to carve out meaning and beauty in a life of such constraint. As we drift off into dreams ourselves, safely cocooned in the realized promises of modern comfort and stability that they could scarcely imagine, perhaps we would do well to carry a bit of their strength with us, to recognize in their struggle some echo of the universal human condition, and draw inspiration from the way they endured and even found small joys while faced with such crushing hardship. The peasants of feudal Japan may be centuries gone, but their spirit lives on, whispering to us from the mists of history. What stories will we add to theirs? What light will we bring to our chapter of the human tale? In our softly lit, climate-controlled rooms, these are questions to ponder as we slip into the waiting embrace of sleep. The struggles and triumphs of our ancestors have brought us the privilege of that restful reverie. May we use it well. As the sun dips below the wooded hills, casting long shadows across the rice paddies. The peasants of the village gather their tools and begin the long walk back to their thatched roof huts. Their backs ache from hours bent over in the fields, their hands rough and calloused from gripping the primitive farming implements. Even the children, some as young as 5 or 6, bear the marks of labor on their small hands and feet. Life in feudal Japan was not easy for anyone, but for the peasants, it was an existence defined by unending toil, constant hunger, and the ever-present fear of samurai swords. They were born into this life of servitude with no hope of ever rising above their station. The social hierarchy was rigid and unyielding, a fact reinforced by the great military leaders and samurai who jealously guarded their power and privilege. One such leader was Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate that would rule Japan for over 250 years. Born into a minor samurai family, Ieyasu rose to become one of the most powerful men in the country through a combination of military prowess, political maneuvering, and sheer ruthlessness. He cemented his control through the implementation of a strict class system that placed the samurai at the top and the peasants at the bottom, with no chance of upward mobility. Under Ieyasu's rule, the lives of peasants were tightly controlled and regulated. They were forbidden from leaving their villages without permission, and their activities were closely monitored by the samurai class. Any sign of disobedience or rebellion was met with swift and brutal punishment, often in the form of public executions or the destruction of entire villages. But even in the face of such oppression, the peasants of feudal Japan found ways to carve out a life for themselves. They developed their own culture and traditions, centered around the rhythms of the agricultural seasons and the bonds of family and community. In the evenings after the work was done, they would gather around the hearth to share stories and songs, finding solace in the simple pleasures of good company and a warm fire. As the night grows dark and the stars emerge over the sleeping village, we can imagine the dreams of those long-ago peasants. Dreams of a life free from hunger and fear, of a world where their children might know something more than endless labor and privation. They could not have known then that their struggles would one day be remembered and honored, that their stories would be told and retold down through the centuries. But in the quiet moments before sleep, perhaps they found some small comfort in the knowledge that they were not alone, that they were part of a long and unbroken chain of humanity stretching back through time. The lives of peasants in feudal Japan were defined by the demanding physical labor of rice farming, a task that consumed their days from dawn until dusk. The work was backbreaking and relentless, requiring endless hours of planting, weeding, and harvesting, using only the most basic of tools. The rice paddies themselves were marvels of ingenuity and hard work, carved out of the hilly terrain by generations of peasant farmers. They were irrigated by complex systems of canals and bamboo pipes, designed to bring water from mountain streams down to the thirsty fields. The planting of the rice seedlings was a delicate and time-consuming process, with each tiny shoot carefully placed into the muddy soil by hand. As the rice plants grew tall and green under the summer sun, the peasants worked tirelessly to keep them healthy and free from pests. They would wade through the flooded paddies, their legs sinking deep into the muck, pulling weeds and chasing away the birds that threatened to devour the ripening grain. It was a never-ending battle against the forces of nature, one that required constant vigilance and backbreaking labor. But for all their efforts, the peasants of feudal Japan reaped few rewards. The rice they grew was not theirs to keep, but was instead handed over to the feudal lords as tax and tribute. The daimyo, the great lords who ruled over the provinces, demanded a significant portion of each village's harvest, leaving the peasants with barely enough to survive on. The story of one such village, a small settlement nestled in the mountains of Honshu, illustrates the hardships faced by peasants across the land. It was a poor village, even by the standards of the time. with little arable land and few resources to draw upon. The villagers scratched out a meagre living by growing what rice they could and foraging for wild plants in the forests. One year, the village was struck by a particularly brutal combination of drought and blight, devastating the rice crop and leaving the peasants on the brink of starvation. They pleaded with their feudal lord for mercy, begging for a reduction in the rice tax so that they might have enough to feed their families. But the daimyo was unmoved by their plight and demanded his full share of the harvest, meagre though it was. Faced with the prospect of watching their children starve, the villagers made the desperate decision to hide a portion of the rice, hoping to keep it for themselves. But they were betrayed by one of their own, a man who sought to curry favor with the Lord by revealing the village's secret. The punishment was swift and brutal, with the village burned to the ground and its inhabitants left to fend for themselves in the wild. It was a story that played out time and again across feudal Japan, a testament to the unyielding cruelty of the feudal system and the precarious existence of the peasantry. For all their toil and sacrifice, they were ultimately at the mercy of their feudal masters, with little hope of ever escaping the cycle of poverty and oppression. And yet, even in the darkest of times, the peasants of Japan found ways to resist and rebel against their oppressors. One of the most famous examples of peasant defiance was the story of Sakura Sogoro, a village headman who dared to stand up to the cruel practices of his samurai overlords. Sogoro's village, like so many others, had been struggling under the heavy burden of taxation and the constant demands of the local daimyo. The peasants were forced to give up an ever-increasing portion of their harvest, leaving them with barely enough to feed their families. Sogoro, a respected leader within the village, decided to take action. He gathered together a group of fellow peasants and made the long journey to the capital city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, hoping to present a petition to the shogun himself. It was a risky move, as peasants were strictly forbidden from directly appealing to the highest levels of government. But Sogoro was determined to seek justice for his people. Arriving in Edo, Sogoro and his companions managed to gain an audience with the shogun's officials, who listened to their complaints with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Sogoro laid out his case, describing the impossible burdens placed on the peasants and begging for relief. But his pleas fell on deaf ears, and he and his companions were turned away. Undeterred, Sogoro decided to take his protest to the next level. In a desperate bid to gain attention, he and his fellow peasants seated themselves outside the shogun's castle gate, refusing to move until their grievances were addressed. It was a bold and unprecedented act of defiance, one that sent shockwaves through the samurai bureaucracy. In the end, however, Sogoro's bravery was met with brutal repression. The shogun's officials, enraged by the peasants' audacity, ordered them to be arrested and imprisoned. Sogoro himself was singled out for particularly harsh punishment and was ultimately executed as an example to others who might dare to challenge the social order. The story of Sakura Sogoro became a legend among the peasantry, a symbol of the indomitable spirit of the common people in the face of oppression. But it was also a reminder of the futility of armed resistance against the might of the samurai class. For centuries, the peasants of Japan would continue to suffer under the yoke of feudalism, with little hope of change or relief. As the years passed, the life of the average peasant in feudal Japan only grew harder and more precarious. The population of the country was growing rapidly, putting ever-increasing pressure on the limited arable land. At the same time, the ruling samurai class was becoming increasingly divorced from the realities of agricultural production, more concerned with the pursuit of art, literature, and military glory than with the well-being of the peasantry. The result was a society that was both highly stratified and deeply unstable, with a growing gap between the wealthy elite and the impoverished masses. Famines became more and more common, as the land struggled to support the burgeoning population and the demands of the feudal lords. For the peasants, these famines were nothing short of catastrophic. With little food stored up and no way to escape the cycle of poverty, they were left at the mercy of the elements and the whims of their masters. A single failed harvest could spell doom for an entire village, leaving families to starve or flee into the wilderness in a desperate bid for survival. One of the worst famines in Japanese history struck the country in the late 18th century during the reign of the Tokugawa shogunate. Known as the Tenmei famine, it was caused by a devastating combination of drought, floods, and crop failures that left millions of peasants on the brink of starvation. Contemporary accounts paint a grim picture of the suffering endured by the common people during this time. Villages were abandoned as families fled in search of food, their emaciated bodies littering the roadsides. Those who remained behind were forced to survive on a diet of grass, tree bark, and even clay, their stomachs distended from the indigestible matter. The Tokugawa government, for its part, did little to alleviate the suffering of the peasantry during the famine. Samurai officials were more concerned with maintaining order and suppressing any signs of unrest than with providing aid to the starving masses. What little relief that was offered often came in the form of loans that only drove the peasants further into debt and despair. It was against this backdrop of misery and oppression that peasant uprisings began to become more and more common in the later years of the Tokugawa period. Driven to desperation by hunger, taxation, and mistreatment, some villages took up arms against their feudal masters in a bid for survival and justice. One of the most famous of these uprisings was the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 to 1638, a massive peasant revolt that took place on the southern island of Kyushu. The rebellion was sparked by a combination of factors, including religious persecution, oppressive taxation, and the desperation of famine-stricken peasants. Led by a charismatic Christian ronin named Amakusa Shiro, the rebels seized control of the Hara castle and declared their independence from the samurai authorities. For months, they held out against a massive siege by the shogunate's armies. Their ranks swelled by thousands of peasants from the surrounding countryside. In the end, however, the rebellion was brutally suppressed by the superior military might of the samurai. The castle was stormed, and the rebels were massacred, their leaders crucified, and their families sold into slavery. It was a tragic end to a desperate struggle, one that underscored the futility of armed resistance against the entrenched power of the feudal system. And yet, even in the face of such overwhelming odds, the peasants of feudal Japan found ways to resist and endure. They developed their own culture and traditions, distinct from those of the samurai elite, centered around the rhythms of the agricultural year and the bonds of village life. In the hardscrabble farming villages of the countryside, life was a constant struggle against the elements and the demands of the feudal lords. But it was also a life rich in simple pleasures and small joys, moments of respite from the unending cycle of toil and privation. The women of the village would gather together to weave cloth and share stories, their nimble fingers working the looms as they gossiped and laughed. Children would play in the mud of the rice paddies, chasing frogs and dragonflies with carefree abandon. And in the evenings, the elders would gather around the hearth to share tales of the past and wisdom for the future, passing down the oral traditions of the village from one generation to the next. These moments of joy and connection were precious and fleeting, but they served as a reminder of the resilience and humanity of the peasantry in the face of unimaginable hardship. They were a testament to the enduring spirit of a people who refused to be broken by the cruelties of the feudal system, who found ways to carve out a life of meaning and purpose, even in the darkest of times. But for all their resilience and strength, the peasants of feudal Japan were ultimately trapped in a system that was designed to keep them in their place, to extract their labor and their loyalty while offering little in return. For centuries, the country remained mired in a state of economic and social stagnation, with little progress or development for the vast majority of its people. While the samurai elite pursued the refinements of art, literature, and military prowess, the peasantry remained largely unchanged, their lives dictated by the demands of rice cultivation and the whims of their feudal masters. What innovations and advancements did occur were largely confined to the urban centres and the privileged classes, leaving the countryside to languish in poverty and neglect. It was not until the arrival of the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century that Japan would begin to emerge from its feudal past and embark on a path of modernization and reform. The old social order was swept away, and a new era of industrial development and political change began to take hold. But for the peasants of the old feudal system, the scars of centuries of oppression and hardship would linger long after the samurai had faded into history. Their stories and their struggles would become part of the fabric of Japanese culture, a reminder of the deep roots of the country's past and the enduring spirit of its common people. As we drift off to sleep, our thoughts may turn to those long-ago peasants, toiling in the rice paddies under the blazing sun or huddled around a flickering hearth on a cold winter's night. We may feel a sense of connection to their struggles and their joys, a recognition of the common humanity that binds us all across the ages. In their stories, we may find echoes of our own lives and our own struggles, reminders of the resilience and the dignity of the human spirit in the face of adversity. And in the quiet moments before sleep, we may take comfort in the knowledge that we are part of a long and unbroken chain of history, stretching back through the centuries to the rice fields and villages of feudal Japan. The peasants of that long ago time may have lived lives of unimaginable hardship and suffering, but they also knew moments of joy and connection, of love and laughter in the face of all the odds. Their stories and their struggles are a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, the invincible summer that can flourish even in the darkest of winters. So let us drift off to sleep with a sense of gratitude for the comfort and security of our own lives, and a sense of kinship with all those who have come before us, laboring and loving and dreaming under the same eternal sky. Let us dream of a world where all people can live lives of dignity and purpose, free from the yoke of oppression and the burden of want. And let us wake in the morning with renewed determination to build that world, to honor the struggles and the sacrifices of those who came before us, by working to create a future of justice and compassion for all. For in the end, that is the only way to truly honor the memory of the peasants of feudal Japan and all those who have toiled and suffered in the long march of human history. So, good night and sweet dreams, as we rest in the knowledge that we are part of a story that is still being written, a story of hope and resilience in the face of all the challenges and hardships of the human condition. May we find strength and inspiration in the tales of those who came before us, and may we use that strength to build a better world for all those who will come after. Continuing the script. Even in the most trying of circumstances, moments of beauty and meaning could still bloom like hardy wildflowers. Village life was a tapestry woven from the threads of hardship. Yes, but also from the more delicate fibers of community, tradition, and shared joys. Picture, if you will, a crisp autumn evening. The rice harvest is finally complete, and the village is abuzz with preparation for the festival of Niname-sai. Colourful banners flutter between the humble huts, and the savoury aroma of roasting chestnuts perfumes the air. Children dash to and fro, their laughter a bell-like counterpoint to the rhythmic pounding of mochi rice cakes. Amid the bustle, an elderly grandmother sits serenely, a wisp of a smile on her weathered face, as she watches the antics of her boisterous grandchildren. To them, She is a living bridge to the past, a keeper of the village's stories and legends. They gather around her, eager faces turned up like blossoms to the sun, as she begins to spin a tale of the mischievous kitsune fox spirits that are said to dwell in the woods beyond the rice paddies. For a few precious hours, the spectre of hunger and toil fades into the background, replaced by the warmth of laughter, the glow of lanterns, and the sense of belonging to something greater than oneself. It is a reminder that even the most downtrodden spirit yearns for meaning and connection. But as the festival fires burn down to embers and the villagers drift off to sleep, the same old challenges await them with the dawning of a new day. The fundamental injustice and oppression of the feudal system remains, as immovable as the mountains on the horizon. Generations of peasants would be born, live, and die under this unyielding status quo, their lives playing out like so many verses in a mournful folk song. While art, culture, and politics evolved in the rarefied world of the samurai and nobility, the lot of the average rice farmer remained largely unchanged, an inheritance of unremitting labor and scarcity handed down from father to son, mother to daughter. It's a sobering thing to contemplate, lying here in the dark, our modern minds struggling to bridge the gulf of centuries. How many nameless souls toiled under the tyranny of this feudal hierarchy? Their suffering lost to history like tears in the rain. How many dreams were crushed under the weight of oppression? How many voices silenced by the implacable hand of fate? And yet, even in the face of such unrelenting adversity, the human spirit endured, in the love between parent and child, in the bonds of community and tradition, in the simple joys of a good harvest or a well-told tale. The peasants of feudal Japan found the strength to carry on, to imbue their harsh lives with slivers of meaning and grace. Their resilience is a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit, an ember that refuses to be snuffed out no matter how dark the night. And as we drift off to sleep, our minds filled with the echoes of their stories, perhaps we can draw some small measure of courage from their example. For in the end, the peasants of feudal Japan were more than just voiceless cogs in the gears of history. They were fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, lovers and dreamers. They lived and struggled and found moments of joy in a world that was far too often defined by pain. And in doing so, they left a legacy of resilience and quiet dignity that still resonates down through the ages. So let us honor their memory, even as we count our blessings in this modern age. And let us never forget the hard-won lessons of their lives. That hope can spring eternal even in the darkest of times, and that the human spirit, though often tested, is ultimately unbreakable. As we surrender ourselves to the embrace of sleep, let us carry their stories with us into our dreams, a reminder of how far we've come and the work that still lies ahead. For in the end, the tale of the peasants of feudal Japan is not just a dusty footnote in the annals of history. It is a living testament to the enduring power of the human heart and a challenge to us all to build a world where such suffering is but a fading memory. Small joys and simple pleasures were a precious respite from the toil and struggle of peasant life. After a long day bent over in the rice fields, with muscles aching and hands blistered, returning to the village at dusk offered a chance to connect with family and neighbours. Gathering around a hearth fire, sipping weak tea, and sharing a meagre meal of rice and vegetables, families could take comfort in being together and off their feet, if only for a short while before an early bedtime. Children too young to work would play humble games with pebbles, sticks and rags, laughing and chasing each other through the dirt lanes between thatched huts. Their voices and pattering feet brought a sparkle of levity and life to the weary atmosphere. Elderly grandparents, too frail for fieldwork, would sit outside in the fading light, smoking pipes and sharing stories of the past. They spoke of ancestors, lean years long ago, and village legends, fantastic tales of mischievous fox spirits and mountain goblins that made the young ones gasp and giggle. These oral traditions passed the time and also passed down a sense of identity and belonging rooted in this rustic place. Most peasant villages held several festivals throughout the year, often linked to the agricultural calendar and Shinto or Buddhist faith. Though a far cry from the lavish celebrations of the cities with their colourful processions and myriad food stalls, village matsuri still offered a joyous break from the daily grind. Women would weave and dye simple cotton decorations to hang outside homes and around the humble wooden shrine. Children gathered wildflowers to make offerings at the altar, hoping for blessings of good weather and harvests ahead. Drummers and flutists, though not always skilled, lifted spirits with traditional tunes. What little special food could be had was shared out among all, perhaps some mochi rice cakes, a simmered vegetable stew, even a carefully rationed jug of sake. For a few merry hours, cares were forgotten, and the sense of fellowship and face flourished. Neighbours who squabbled over a boundary marker earlier that week would share a cup and a laugh together. Young people especially looked forward to festival time as a chance to socialise and perhaps glimpse a future partner. With marriage usually arranged by families in the peasant class, Matsuri offered a rare opportunity for young men and women to interact more casually, walking and talking together as they admired the modest festivities. A shy smile, a shared sweet, hands brushing as they circled the shrine. Such little moments gave rise to big dreams of domestic happiness in the future, when youthful toil would give way to the next generation of village life. Of course, these festivals were just occasional breaks in the long march of hardship that was the peasant experience. But they were crucial nonetheless, something to look forward to, memories of joy and belonging to sustain the spirit through harsher times. For in truth, harsh times were never far off in feudal Japan if you were unfortunate enough to be born a peasant. Century after century, the basic pattern of rural life remained largely unchanged, an endless cycle of planting and reaping, sweating and surviving, with little hope of anything more. While peasants gritted their teeth and endured this existence from sunrise to sundown, the upper echelons of society lived a very different life. In the great castle towns like Edo and Osaka, samurai lords and ladies pursued refined arts and a leisure in their elegant homes. Tea ceremonies, flower arranging, poetry composition, and other genteel pastimes whiled away their hours. Merchants grew fat on the profits of growing trade and conspicuous consumption. Artists and performers found lucrative patronage for their talents among those with wealth and taste. But for the rice growers, life simply went on as it always had. New shogun came and went, edicts were issued from on high, wars and intrigues played out in the corridors of power. But peasants remained peasants, tilling the soil and feeding the nation as their ancestors had for generations. A bad harvest or cruel overseer could spell disaster for a village, while the political maneuverings of those above rarely trickled down to improve daily life. This is not to say that agricultural methods and techniques remained completely static through the long feudal era. Farmers did gradually develop better tools, irrigation, fertilizers, and seed varieties that boosted yields to some degree. But the basic dynamics of rural society, rigid hierarchy, heavy taxation, and subsistence living, continued to keep peasants firmly at the bottom of the structure. It was not until the arrival of the modern age in the mid-19th century that this ancient system truly began to crack and shift. With the opening of Japan to Western trade and influence, the influx of new technologies and ideas, and the increasing pressure for social reform, the Tokugawa shogunate finally fell. The new Meiji government set about transforming Japan's institutions and economy at a rapid clip. Land reform, agricultural modernization, transportation and education gave many peasants opportunities their forefathers could scarcely imagine, though rural poverty remained an issue. Some left the fields entirely, finding work in the new factories and industries springing up in urban areas. Others saw their sons drafted into military service as Japan built up its fighting forces. The world of the feudal peasant, with all its backbreaking labor, deprivation, and exploitation, was finally beginning to fade into history. But for centuries before that dawn, generations of villagers lived and died by the sweat of their brows, bound to the unforgiving land as surely as the bundled sheaves of rice they hauled on their backs. Theirs was a life circumscribed by duty and necessity, with few comforts and even fewer choices. As we drift off to sleep this night, bellies full and in climate-controlled comfort, we might spare a thought for those who came before, toiling under the hot sun and fitful rains, laying the foundations of the nation field by flooded field. Perhaps, in dreaming, we catch a glimpse of their world, the rough homespun of their clothes, the ache in their bones, the smell of rice straw and wood smoke. We see weathered hands planting seedlings with a timeless patience, hear the creak of a well wheel and the laughter of long-gone children, feel the bonds of family and village that lent some warmth to the cold equations of feudalism. And as the visions of the past blur and soften, we can appreciate how far we have come from those fields and the smallness of joys to be found there. As the sun dipped below the wooded hills, wisps of smoke curled up from the thatched roofs of the village huts. Peasants, their faces weathered and backs bent from years of toil, slowly trudged home from the rice paddies to partake in meager evening meals with their families. This was the daily rhythm of life for the vast majority in feudal Japan, an existence of endless labor and little prospect of change. In the grand scheme of this rigid society, the peasants occupied the very bottom rung. They were the mud upon which the great edifice of samurai warriors, noble lords, and imperial rulers was built. The lowly status of peasants was no mere accident of fate or temporary misfortune. It was a meticulously designed and ruthlessly enforced social order. At the pinnacle of this hierarchy stood formidable figures like Tokugawa Ieyasu, the great shogun who unified Japan under his iron-fisted rule in the early 1600s. Ieyasu codified the class system into immutable law, decreeing that the warriors shall rule, the peasants shall toil, and never the two shall meet. Under his reign and those of his successors, class mobility became nigh impossible. A peasant would live and die as a peasant, with no hope of ever rising above their station. This was the inescapable reality for generation upon generation, a crushing cycle of poverty and servitude. From the moment they were old enough to walk, peasant children joined their parents in the fields, their small hands gripping primitive tools as they learned the back-breaking trade that would define their lives. Season after season, from the first blush of spring through the searing heat of summer and into the biting cold of winter, the peasants labored from dawn until dusk to coax rice from the unyielding earth. Knee-deep in muddy paddies, they would plant, tend, and harvest, their bodies permanently stooped and calloused from the ceaseless toil. An old saying held that a farmer's sweat must drip onto the soil before he dared to partake of its produce. Yet for all their relentless effort, the fruits of the peasants' labor were not theirs to freely enjoy. A crushing burden of taxes and tribute hung over every village like a suffocating shroud. Lords and samurai, from their lofty keeps, demanded an ever-growing share of each harvest, leaving the peasants with barely enough to survive. Season after season, officials would tally up the rice yields, calculating down to the last grain how much each village owed their masters. Woe betide any community that failed to meet its quota. Desperate peasants, faced with hunger and the wrath of the collectors, would borrow heavily, only to sink deeper into debt and servitude. The story of one such ill-fated village comes down to us from the 16th century. After a string of poor harvests left them unable to pay their onerous taxes, the villagers were forced to make a fateful choice. Who among them would sell themselves into bondage to make up the shortfall? In the end, a grim lottery was held, and those unlucky souls whose names were drawn bid tearful farewells to their families before being marched away in chains, unlikely to ever return. Such were the precarious lives of the peasantry, forever at the mercy of the elements and the whims of their samurai overlords. In a society where might made right, the humble farmers had precious few protections against exploitation and abuse. The warriors, for their part, viewed the commoners as little more than chattel to be used and discarded at will. A particularly cruel practice known as kirisute gomen gave samurai free rein to strike down any peasant who displeased them, without fear of consequences. Farmers who failed to bow quickly enough, or who did not yield the road to an approaching samurai, could be cut down on the spot, their lives snuffed out in an instant of arbitrary violence. Even those peasants who diligently obeyed their masters could not escape the spectre of mistreatment. The tragic tale of Sakura Sogoro, a village headman from Edo, illustrates the callous injustice of the feudal order. In the early 1600s, after a series of poor harvests and heavy taxation had left his village on the brink of starvation, Sogoro journeyed to the capital to plead for relief directly with the shogun. In a desperate gambit, he hid himself under a bridge the lord was due to cross, hoping to catch his attention. But Sogoro's pleas for mercy went unheard. For his temerity in approaching the shogun without permission, he and his entire family were arrested and brutally executed as troublemakers. To the peasants of Edo, Sogoro's fate served as a chilling warning of what awaited any who dared to challenge the feudal hierarchy. And yet, for all the cruelty of their masters, the greatest threats to the peasants' precarious existence often came not from the sword, but from the sky. In a society perpetually teetering on the brink of famine, the whims of weather and pestilence could spell the difference between life and death for entire villages. With little food stored up and fields at the mercy of the elements, a single ill-timed storm or drought could wipe out a community's crops, plunging them into starvation. In the wake of such disasters, desperate farmers would hunt for roots and bark, or resort to eating grass in a futile attempt to stave off the gnawing hunger. Some even sold their children into servitude to buy a few more morsels of food. As the decades marched on and the population swelled, such famines became grimly commonplace. In the 1780s, after a catastrophic eruption of Mount Asama blanketed farmlands in ash and triggered a killing frost, crop failures across the country left countless peasants to starve. Mass graves overflowed with the bodies of the dead, as survivors scraped by on whatever meager sustenance they could scavenge. Against such a backdrop of unrelenting misery and injustice, it is little wonder that the peasants would occasionally rise up in desperate, doomed revolts. Driven past the point of endurance by hunger, abuse, and grinding poverty, farmers would band together to vent their fury against the samurai elite. One of the most famous of these uprisings was the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637. On the western island of Kyushu, a band of overtaxed and mistreated peasants, many of them secretly practicing the banned Christian faith, took up arms against their lords. Led by a charismatic youth named Amakusa Shiro, the rebels seized an abandoned castle and held off samurai armies for months. But as with most peasant revolts, the Shimabara Rebellion was ultimately doomed. After a brutal siege, the castle fell and the rebels were annihilated. Thousands were massacred, their bodies left to rot as a warning to others. In the end, little changed for the long-suffering farmers of Shimabara and elsewhere. The terrible cycle of exploitation and misery ground on as it had for centuries. Yet even in such relentlessly bleak circumstances, the human spirit endured. In the face of unimaginable hardship, Japan's peasants managed to carve out small moments of joy and meaning. The bonds of family and community served as a bulwark against despair, giving farmers a sense of belonging and shared purpose. In the evenings, after the day's labours were done, villagers would gather around the hearths in their small huts to share what meager food they had. Mothers would sing softly as they mended clothes or wove baskets, while fathers regaled their children with well-worn tales of heroes and spirits. During the fleeting festivals that marked the turning of the seasons, the drudgery of daily life would briefly lift. Villagers donned their finest clothes and came together to feast, dance, and give thanks for what blessings they enjoyed. For a few precious days, the spectre of hunger and toil would fade into the background, replaced by laughter, music, and revelry. But such moments of reprieve were all too brief. For the peasants of feudal Japan, life remained a relentless struggle for survival against crushing odds. Generations would live and die without ever knowing a world beyond the narrow confines of their village and the ceaseless demands of their feudal masters. As Japan's samurai elite grew ever wealthier and more refined, pouring their energies into art, literature, and the tea ceremony, life for the lowly peasantry remained mired in medieval stagnation. While the lords nibbled on exquisite delicacies in their gleaming castles, farmers scratched out a meager subsistence from the unforgiving earth. This state of affairs would endure for centuries, ossifying into a rigid and seemingly eternal order. It must have been nigh impossible for most peasants to conceive of a world where their children or grandchildren might lead different lives, free from the tyranny of their overlords and the pitiless whims of nature. And yet, change would come at last, albeit far too late for the countless generations who suffered under the yoke of feudalism. Only with the dawning of the Meiji era in the late 1800s, when Japan threw open its doors to the wider world and embarked on a dizzying course of modernization, would the lot of the common people begin to meaningfully improve. The road from feudal servitude to modern citizenship would be long and rocky, marked by wrenching upheavals and dislocations. But slowly, steadily, the peasants' descendants would claw their way up from the mud, seizing the opportunities presented by education, industrialization, and social reform. As we drift off to sleep tonight in our comfortable beds, our bellies full and our worries a world away from the unrelenting hardship of feudal life, we might spare a thought for those long-ago farmers. Through back-breaking labor and unimaginable suffering, they laid the humble foundations upon which Japan's modern prosperity would one day be built. In their resilience, their quiet dignity in the face of adversity, we might see a glimmer of the very best of the human spirit. Though their names are lost to history and their individual struggles forgotten, the peasants of feudal Japan remind us of the extraordinary capacity of ordinary people to endure and, against all odds, to leave a better world for the generations that follow. So let us honor their memory, even as we give thanks for the immense progress and privilege we enjoy today. And as we slip into the warm embrace of slumber, let us dream of a world where no one needs suffer as they did, where all may live with dignity, security, and hope for a brighter tomorrow. As the sun began to set over the village, casting long shadows across the rice paddies, the peasants slowly made their way back to their humble thatched roof homes. Hands calloused and backs aching from hours of toil in the fields, they gathered together for a simple evening meal of rice gruel and pickled vegetables. The air was filled with the aroma of cooking fires and the soft murmur of conversation as families huddled together, finding solace in each other's company after another long day of hardship. For these peasants, life was an endless cycle of back-breaking labor, heavy taxation, and the constant threat of samurai exploitation. They were born into a rigidly structured society where class mobility was virtually non-existent, destined to spend their days serving the whims of their feudal lords. Even the most diligent and skilled among them could never hope to rise above their station, forever bound to the land and the mercy of those who ruled over them. But despite the immense challenges they faced, the peasants of feudal Japan found ways to cherish the small joys in life. They came together for village festivals, marriages, and religious ceremonies, finding solace in the bonds of community and tradition. In the evenings, women would gather to weave and sing, their voices rising in haunting melodies that spoke of love, loss, and the resilience of the human spirit. Old-timers would regale children with tales of generations past, passing down the wisdom and folklore that had sustained their people through countless hardships. One such figure who embodied the indomitable spirit of the peasantry was a humble farmer named Taka. Born into a life of poverty and toil, Taka had known nothing but the relentless demands of the rice fields since childhood. With a quick wit and a kind heart, he became known throughout the village for his ability to bring a smile to even the weariest of faces. When a devastating typhoon struck the region, destroying crops and leaving many families destitute, Taka worked tirelessly to help his neighbors rebuild, sharing what little he had and rallying the community together in the face of adversity. Despite his best efforts, however, Taka and his fellow peasants continued to suffer under the oppressive yoke of the samurai class. The warrior elite, exemplified by figures like the ruthless warlord Hideki, saw the peasantry as little more than chattel to be exploited and abused at will. Under the brutal practice of kirisute gomen, samurai were granted the right to strike down any commoner who dared to offend them, leaving the peasants to live in constant fear for their lives. As the years passed and the population grew, life for the peasants only became more precarious. Famines became increasingly common as the land struggled to support the ever-growing numbers of mouths to feed. In times of desperation, some villagers were driven to rebel against their oppressors, rising up in bloody uprisings like the ill-fated Shimabara rebellion. But such revolts were always brutally suppressed by the samurai, who saw any challenge to their authority as a threat to be mercilessly crushed. And so, for centuries, the peasants of feudal Japan endured a life of unrelenting hardship and stagnation, while the elite samurai class indulged in the refinements of art, culture, and politics. The vast majority of the population remained trapped in a never-ending cycle of poverty and servitude. It was a world where the accident of birth determined one's entire fate, where dreams of a better life were little more than fleeting illusions. But as we drift off to sleep in our own comfortable beds, centuries removed from the trials and tribulations of feudal Japan, it's worth reflecting on the incredible resilience and fortitude of those long-suffering peasants. Despite the crushing weight of the society they lived under, they found ways to persevere, to find joy and meaning in the small moments of life. Their stories may be lost to time, but their spirit lives on, a testament to the enduring strength of the human will. And so, as we close our eyes and let the cares of the modern world fade away, let us spare a thought for the peasants of old Japan and the countless generations of unsung heroes who came before us. May their struggles and their triumphs never be forgotten. And may we strive to build a world where the dignity and worth of every human being is cherished and upheld. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the pages of history. If you enjoyed this exploration of feudal Japan and the lives of its long-suffering peasants, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more engrossing tales from the annals of our shared past. Until next time, sweet dreams, and may your slumber be filled with visions of a brighter tomorrow.